Hello to everybody. I'm Glenn Most, and I've been charged with the grievous task of moderating the next two talks. Welcome to the Einstein Forum. Welcome to Illuminations. Welcome to two talks after lunch. My name is Glenn Most, and sitting on my right is Rainey Daston. And if you don't know who Rainey Daston is, you don't belong here. So I'm not going to say anything more about her, except to say that the image on the back shows the last lecture that she gave at the Einstein Forum. She's the woman in pink about to sing to an enraptured audience. Today, she will sing to us about diversity and universalism.
Thank you, Glenn. I've always wanted to be in a Watteau or a Fragonard. So I do realize that it's after lunch on a very hot day, so I am going to try and be as brief as possible. What this means, and I crave the indulgence of my fellow historians, is that I am going to leapfrog across centuries in a way that will make some of you seasick. Please stick with me and recall that I am trying to compress a very long history into 30 minutes. So, as has already been mentioned many times, the Enlightenment is a history of argument, and it's a history of argument of the Enlightenment with itself. And I'm going to talk about one of those arguments today, which is the quarrel between diversity and universalism. It pitted two star philosophes against one another, Montesquieu and Condorcet. Montesquieu's De l'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, famously argued that the diversity of climates and topographies created a matching diversity of cultures, and that legislators should respect that diversity by tailoring the laws to the needs of those cultures and climates. This is not a new idea. It's as old as Herodotus's observation that in Egypt everything was topsy-turvy by ancient Greek standards, both nature and culture. So just as the Nile flows south to north in Egypt, unlike proper Greek rivers, which flow from north to south, so Egyptian men stay home and weave at their looms, while Egyptian women go out to the market to truck and barter. That's not why Montesquieu's book caused a sensation. These were old chestnuts endlessly recycled since ancient times. The reason why it caused a furore was that it mustered a dazzling display of comparative legal examples, both ancient and modern, both European and non-European, to sharpen the point that laws should match cultures. And then he aimed this barbed weapon against the efforts of the French crown to standardize regional customs into centralized uniform law for the entire kingdom. This had been the project of Colbert, amongst other ministers. And Montesquieu buttressed his arguments about ineradicable cultural diversity with claims about natural diversity. So not just the diversity of climates, but also of physiology. For example, how could one expect the peoples of Spain, made highly excitable and irritable by their hot climate that dilated their nerve endings, to follow the same laws as the phlegmatic Germans and Dutch, who, because of their cold climates, had contracted nerves to the point that they had to get drunk as skunks to feel anything at all? Montesquieu was much admired for his liberal principles during the Enlightenment, especially his doctrine of the separation of powers and his opposition to the overweening ambitions of absolute monarchs. But Condorcet, another passionate Enlightenment liberal, took vehement exception to what he regarded as Montesquieu's attack on universal natural rights. And thanks to David, I now have an adjective to modify this universalism. We are talking about abstract universalism here. So Condorcet wrote a commentary on the 29th book of The Spirit of the Laws, in which Montesquieu argued, amongst other things, that a law which had been quite good for the Romans was very bad for the modern French. At this point, Condorcet threw down the gauntlet. So because truth, reason, justice, the rights of man, property, interest, liberty, and security are the same everywhere, all provinces of a state, and even all states, should have the same criminal, civil, and commercial laws. A good law should be good for everyone, just as a true proposition is true for all. So just as Montesquieu had propped up his defense of legal diversity by appeal to the diversity of natural habitats from the subtropical Mediterranean to the vast Asian plains or North American forests, so Condorcet defended legal universality in the name of natural law, defined in Roman law as that which human beings share with the animals and elevated by early modern jurists like Grotius and Pufendorf to the status of the foundation of all law for all peoples. He defended it with analogies to celestial mechanics. So depending on which nature one chose to emphasize, either the patchwork quilt of ecosystems or the stately regularities of celestial mechanics, you could be enlisted on either side of the Enlightenment quarrel between diversity and universalism. But the debate was never really about the facts of nature. It wasn't even about the facts of human nature. It was about the clashing values of diversity and universalism. We're once again in the midst of a quarrel between the values of diversity and universalism, and it looks as if the party of Montesquieu is winning. You've all seen pictures like this one. It's startling, really startling, especially if you're as old as I am, to realize how quickly and thoroughly the value of diversity, until a few decades ago, a value largely confined to the aesthetic and organic realms, how quickly it has acquired deep political and moral significance. Universities, corporations, governments are now judged by the degree to which they achieve diversity among their leaders and recognize diversity among their publics. Older values of the liberal polity, for example, that of honoring merit without regard to creed, race, sex, or ethnicity, have been increasingly eclipsed by values that closely attend to these and other differentiating traits. And which traits are relevant is a matter of contention and highly context sensitive. Universalism has become an object of suspicion, as we heard several times this morning, either as the interests of a particular privileged group, masquerading as the interests of all humanity, or simply as a failure to appreciate the richness and potential of diversity. And most striking of all is how diversity is not merely espoused, but deeply, and I think sincerely, felt as a value. I think this is especially the case, but not exclusively the case, for younger people in many countries. My students react to perceived violations of diversity as they would react to violations of fairness and equality. And however much diversity, equity, inclusion, these DEI statements are ridiculed as performative at best and hypocritical at worst, the diversity that they so clumsily seek to uphold is not a matter, I think, of mere lip service. It has solidified into a moral intuition. And that's my problem today. I'm really interested in the history of the self-evident. I'm interested in how things which were barely thinkable within my lifetime have now solidified to the point that one reacts not even intellectually anymore, but viscerally to perceived violations of the value. So I'm interested in how something becomes a value. I therefore want to take a look at the history of diversity as a value, and I'm going to argue that it's been a value for a very long time, but not a moral and political value. It's been an aesthetic value since antiquity. It's been an economic and we might say, organic value since the 19th century. And I'm going to argue further that part of the speed and thoroughness with which diversity entrenched itself as a self-evident moral intuition in the political and moral realm has to do with the fact that diversity is piggybacking on these other senses, these other values of diversity. That is, I wish to question the divisions we habitually make between different kinds of values, the aesthetic value, the economic values, the political and moral values, perhaps even the epistemic values, and suggest that there are subterranean corridors that unite these values, however useful these distinctions might be in a philosophical context. So, first, diversity as beauty. So it's not an accident that Montesquieu turned to natural history, the natural history of his day, to illustrate diversity. Since ancient times, the overflowing fecundity of nature, the sheer exuberant excess of its colors and its forms, has served as the preeminent example of diversity as beauty. For the Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, there's something wondrous about the gorgeous but apparently totally pointless proliferation of flowers. And in his compendious Historia Naturalis, he traced the beginnings of painting to artists' attempts to mimic and surpass the infinite variety of flowers. Pliny thought flowers showed nature at play. Quote, nature is in her most sportive mood, playful in her great joy at her varied fertility. Almost 2,000 years later, when the German philosopher Immanuel Kant cast about for an example of beauty that commands adoration just because it serves no purpose and can be subsumed under no concept, what first came to mind were not paintings, not sculptures, but flowers. Flowers were more than nature's own artworks. They also evoked the purest, the freest aesthetic judgment. The enormous commercial and later imperialist European expansion during the 16th and 17th centuries not only enriched gardens with imported exotica like passion flowers from the Americas and tulips from the Levant, they immensely expanded the variety of both natural and artificial objects in bustling port cities like Lisbon or Antwerp. The aesthetic of diversity also expanded to embrace these novelties, from Chinese porcelain to polished nautilus shells from the Indo-Pacific. Still life paintings like this one from the period, these I think are the 17th century equivalents of our glossy advertising photos, juxtapose these expensive rarities in a visual allegory of luxury, variety, and virtuosity in the works of both art and nature. Depictions of lands newly opened up to trade and conquest, like this one by Jan van Kessel, it's part of a series in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich on the continents, they feature a similar aesthetic of diversity, blurring the boundaries between art and nature and between cultures and commodities. The early modern aesthetic of diversity probably achieved its most memorable expression in the deliberate miscellany of the Wunderkammer, which were sort of the zany ancestors of our staid modern museums, in which two-headed snakes were displayed next to delicate frigates carved from ivory, insects preserved in amber with stuffed crocodiles, unicorn horns with exquisite clockwork. In all of its mutations, from the flowering meadow of Pliny to the Wunderkammer, the aesthetic of diversity never shed its associations with excess above and beyond any conceivable utility, any conceivable purpose. And although pointed pointlessness often allied diversity with luxury, this was not a necessary association. It's very present in the still lifes, but it's not a necessary association. Diversity for its own sake could even trump high-price finery. Leibniz once mused that nobody would want all of their clothing to have just diamond buttons. He would want a pleasing diversity. He says he doesn't want all of the books in his library. Remember, he was the librarian for a while at Wolfenbüttel. He doesn't want all the books in his library to be bound with the finest Moroccan leather and stamped with gilt. He wants a pleasing diversity of form, even if it means taking a step down in terms of quality. So even if it's severed from its links with luxury, the aesthetic of diversity was nonetheless intrinsically wastrel, flaunting its prodigal extravagance and disdaining all frugality. So it comes, I think, as something of a shock to find the value of diversity keeping the company of economic efficiency in the late 18th and 19th centuries. This pin factory in Normandy is one of the most famous scenes in all of the history of economics. The image comes from the article on pins, épingles, in Diderot's Encyclopédie, which opens with an evocation of the universe in a grain of sand, or at least of complexity, in the simple pin. The author of the article writes, "The pin is of all mechanical works the tiniest, the most common, the least valuable, and yet one of those that requires perhaps the most combinations. For a pin undergoes 18 operations before it enters commerce." So from the coils of metal that arrive from Hamburg and Sweden to the sticking of the finished pins a dozen at a time into paper slips, the article lays out the manufacture of pins circa 1750 step by step. If it was staffed by experienced workers, this kind of factory, which doesn't have very fancy machines, could turn out a mine spinning 48,000 pins a day. Adam Smith, having read this article, began The Wealth of Nations in 1776 with the pin factory as a shining example of how the division of labor promoted efficiency and technological innovation. The division of labor went on to have an absolutely meteoric career in the 19th and 20th century, well beyond economic theory and industrial applications. It was a key inspiration for Charles Babbage's design of the first computer, the analytical engine, as well as for Emile Durkheim's theory of organic solidarity of advanced societies. The principle could be as readily applied to the factory assembly line as to the steps in a computer program, or, as one sees here, to the differentiation of functions in a bustling city, in which the cobblers make the shoes, the tailors make the clothes, the masons lay the bricks, the bakers bake the bread, and so on. By the mid-19th century, the division of labor became a keystone of political economy and almost synonymous with efficiency. But for our purposes, the most consequential application of the principle of the division of labor was to the life sciences, first to physiology and then to evolutionary theory. Specialization by task or function might produce diversity, all those different jobs that keep Paris running, but it did not produce beauty. It was the biologist who discovered how to connect the old diversity of beauty in nature with the new diversity of efficiency in human society, and indeed to use the one to explain the other. The French physiologist and comparative zoologist Henri Milne-Edwards had been the beneficiary of the vast natural history collections amassed during the 18th and early 19th century, as well as the efforts made to bring some classificatory order into what had seemed to be the infinite variety of living organisms. And just to give you some sense of the magnitude of this task, so when Linnaeus first publishes his wishfully entitled System of Nature, Systema Naturae, in 1735, it's only 12 pages long. And I say wishfully because it's not clear that there is a system of nature. When he gets to the 12th edition in 1769, So many new species have been discovered that it's 2,300 pages long, which gives you some idea of the overwhelming diversity that someone like Milne Edwards, heir to such collections, was dealing with. Linnaeus scrambled to keep his classification scheme from buckling under the weight of what we would call biodiversity, what Linnaeus called the Almighty's masterpiece. And Milne Edwards was similarly overwhelmed when he's writing in the 1850s by the diversity, which seems to be the primary condition imposed on nature in the formation of animals. But Milne Edwards then says, as a physiologist, but that diversity is really only superficial. If you really look carefully at the organisms, what you'll see is a very strong principle of frugality, economy, nature reusing the same materials over and over again. And he invokes the division of labor. One sees that in the creations of nature, as in the industry of man, it's above all by the division of labor that perfection is obtained. So the idea is really simple. The body of human beings and other complex organisms is exactly analogous to the pin factory. Every organ, like every worker, is specialized to a specific function. So the stomach digests, the brain thinks. Milne Edwards drew, however, from this fairly obvious analogy, a quite paradoxical conclusion. It's precisely, as he says, nature's tendency toward economy that produced this wastrel diversity of forms. So the 7,000 then known species of birds seem to exhibit the most extravagant diversity of color and form, yet nature had achieved this result at, quoting again, little cost, by working and reworking the same materials to different, ever more specialized ends. And in The Origin of the Species in 1859, Darwin made Milne Edwards' insight his own and used it as the foundation of his theory of speciation, once again invoking the division of labor. So the advantage of the diversification in the inhabitants of the same region is in fact the same as that of the physiological division of labor in the organs of the same individual body, a subject so well elucidated by Milne Edwards. This is the chapter in The Origin, for those of you who know it well, in which it's on the divergence of character, and it's the one that has the one and only famous diagram of all of the branching, sort of rhizomic-like descendants. And that's, the motor that's driving this, according to Darwin, is the division of labor. So nature is no longer a Wunderkammer, it's an economy that's run on the most efficient principles to yield maximum productivity. It's no longer a playground for nature's fertile fancy, but an arena of ferocious competition for scarce resources. Yet in Darwin's account of speciation, diversity as beauty and diversity as efficiency merged. Pliny's wondrous cornucopia of natural forms merged with Adam Smith's pin factory. The result was our current understanding and appreciation of biodiversity. Both the aesthetic values of diversity and the economic ones still resonate as undertones in the most recent incarnation of diversity as a value, this time in the political realm. One of the most striking aspects of the political value of diversity as inclusion is its sudden appearance and rapid spread. So this is a Google engram. One should always take these with a liberal dose of caution, but it's really very suggestive. So this is for English books. And this is a canon of millions and millions of books. And this particular diagram combines both American and British books. If you disaggregate them, the effect in the American case is even more striking. So you see a kind of puttering along of, the word diversity, and then it starts to climb, and then around 1990 it really begins to take off. If you do this for Diversität in German, you get a really similar curve, but it's displaced. It's a little bit later in time that you get the peak. If you do it for diversité in French, you get a similar effect, also slightly displaced, but then you get, and this would bear further investigation, Eva and I had a discussion about what the causes might be, you get a steep decline after about 2005. Very speculatively, Eva and I interpret this as French Universalism fighting back, but it would bear more in investigation. And if you drill down, what you can do with the Google Ngram is you can drill down to the books they're using. So if you look at this earlier period of sort of the slight rising above 1950, you get titles like Ecological Diversity and Its Measurement from 1988, or Forest Diversity from 1978. But after about 1990, you start getting titles like Disease and Social Diversity, 1996, Cultural Diversity in Organizations, 1994. And if you focus just on the most recent time slice for which this is valid, say 2009 to 2014, the biodiversity titles have been almost entirely replaced by titles like Diversity at Work, The Practice of Inclusion, 2013, and the Encyclopedia of Diversity and Social Justice, 2014. So this is purely linguistic evidence. It's merely suggestive, but it does indicate that the value of diversity as inclusion is now the dominant meaning of the word. So how did this happen? This is still a history in the making, and I fully expect, as I said, to find significant variations in different languages and in the polities that speak them. However, since the mutation in meaning seems to have occurred earliest in English and indeed earliest in American English, it's worth taking a closer look at events there that catapulted diversity as inclusion into title-grabbing prominence. And as I said, I can't stress this enough. What I'm presenting here is preliminary. I fully expect revisions on the basis of further research. But still, taking it for what we have, it is extremely interesting. It seems to be that the pivot of this history is a U.S. Supreme Court decision in the case of Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California in 1978. So Alan Bakke was a 30-year-old ex-Marine who had applied to medical school at the University of California at Davis and been rejected twice. And he sued the University of California system on the grounds that he thought that they had reserved places for less well-qualified black candidates, which had prevented him, despite his, he thought, better qualifications, from being admitted to medical school. And that was a violation of his rights to equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The majority opinion of the Supreme Court struck down the university's policy of reserving a certain number of places in each medical school class for black students as unconstitutional, but it did uphold the university's right to take race into account as one dimension among many in the evaluation of applicants in the interest, and this is the word in the Supreme Court decision, in the interest of diversity. So writing for the majority, Justice Lewis Powell cited with approval Harvard University's recently enlarged, quote, concept of diversity to include students from disadvantaged economic, racial, and ethnic groups. And he went on to provide a vivid example. It turns out that this vivid example comes from an amicus curiae brief from Harvard law professor Archibald Cox, who in turn is citing the admissions office at Harvard. And you see here the kind of justification that would be cited over and over again. I won't read this. You can read it yourself. I just want to note that this example of the farm boy from Idaho, the dean of admissions at the time was a farm boy from Idaho. That's not an accidental example. But the idea here is that it's very much an idea of complementarity, which is just as the farm boy from Idaho can bring a perspective that a Bostonian cannot offer, so a black student might bring a perspective that a white student couldn't offer, and that's perfectly legitimate once all these students have met a certain threshold for doing acceptable academic work at an institution like Harvard. And the policy does seem to have produced, at least at Harvard, some of the desired results. If you look at the class, well, all I've got is sort of the Harvard Law Review. So you look at the Harvard Law Review photo of 1958 of the students there, and there are only 2 women, and they're all white. In fact, one of the women is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, actually. You look at the same Harvard Law Review photo in 1990, it looks very different. And in fact, you see right in the middle the young Barack Obama. So it does seem, it seemed to have achieved what the Dean of Admissions wanted it to achieve. Now, this decision, astonishing in our current age of fractured policies, seems to have pleased everyone. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline saying, "Everyone won." The liberal press saw this as a victory for principles of expanding not only the admissions to elite universities like Harvard, but also the ranks of executives in corporations or officers in the military. Now, I don't want to claim that everybody was happy with this diversity solution. Some of the liberal scholars complained that the celebration of diversity obscured the claims of reparative justice for people who had suffered slavery, violence, and ongoing discrimination. And on the conservative side, people like Judge Posner argued that in order to qualify as a criterion in university admissions, diversity of race must be shown to be educationally relevant. But until the current Supreme Court, that is the one that is presiding right now, overturned the Bakke decision in 2023, notably in a case filed against Harvard, diversity as inclusion was not only the law of the land, it was almost a moral platitude, as unassailable as motherhood and apple pie. I don't wish to exaggerate the influence of a single American court case. Other, arguably far more momentous, political events elsewhere in the world surely prepared the way for the astonishing success of diversity as a political value. And here I can only give one example, but I think it's one that attracted worldwide attention. After the first truly democratic elections in South Africa were held in April 1994, Archbishop Desmond Tutu described South Africans as, quote, "the rainbow people of God. We are free, all of us, black and white together." Now, Tutu's rainbow, as befits an archbishop, was an explicitly religious symbol. It was meant to evoke the covenant between God and humanity after the biblical deluge. But Nelson Mandela adopted the phrase in his inauguration address in May of 1994, and he also underscored its multiracial associations with the multicolored rainbow. We enter into a covenant that we shall build the society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. So in the ramifying arguments and applications of the Bakke decision in realms as various as optimizing decisions in the workplace to fortifying scientific research against bias standpoint epistemology, the principle of the division of labor shadowed the value of diversity as inclusion. So it was plausibly argued by sociologists, by psychologists, even philosophers of science, that teams composed of people representing diverse standpoints, deriving from diverse identities and life experiences, were better at solving problems than more homogeneous groupings. So like the workers in the pin factory, like the organs of the body, each member of the diverse team was perceived to contribute something unique and essential to the success of the whole. And analogies between cultural diversity and biodiversity became commonplace. And especially in the visual representations of the value of diversity as inclusion, you could also catch resonances of the older value of diversity as beauty. In one of his many rhetorical variations on the Rainbow Nation theme, Mandela conjured images that eerily recall Pliny's paean to the diversity of flowers. Each of us is as intimately attached to the soil of this beautiful country as are the famous jacaranda trees of Pretoria and the mimosa trees of the Bushveld, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. Here are the famous jacaranda trees of Pretoria. So nestled in the heart of the political value of diversity as inclusion still lies the multicolored splendor of the flowering meadow, diversity as beauty, which Darwin transmuted into diversity as efficiency. Standing on the shoulders of these older values of diversity, the irresistible rise of the value of diversity as inclusion is perhaps not so mysterious after all. A value is a value is a value, whether it's aesthetic, economic, or political. Let me conclude. So I began with one of the many episodes of the Enlightenment having it out with itself, Montesquieu versus Condorcet, diversity versus universalism. And it's reasonable to ask, okay, who won? There is an ironic argument that claims that with the advent of diversity as inclusion, both sides won, although diversity these days enjoys far better press than universalism does. Their goals largely converge, or so runs this argument. So Condorcet was a fervent campaigner for abolitionism, also for women's rights. He understood his universalism as an open-armed embrace of all people in a worldwide community of equal rights and responsibilities. But I think he might have balked at some other aspect of diversity in its current incarnation. And although I don't believe in the preformationism of ideas, that is, the context in which an idea is originally forged somehow stamps it with a kind of original sin, I don't believe this. But I think in this case, there has been smuggled in unawares an element which is profoundly at odds with the abstract universalism of Condorcet. And that is the idea of diversity being an intrinsic character of individuals, just as he balked at Montesquieu's claim that human cultures were indelibly and intrinsically diverse. No one would deny that the specifics of history and culture, nature and nurture shape individual perspectives and identities. But for Condorcet, these are traits which are strictly irrelevant to your rights as a citizen. They're strictly irrelevant to the fact that you exercise reason or that you have human dignity. Such peculiarities, they might enrich a polity, they might impoverish a polity. One thinks of the possibility of ethnic conflict, but that's all irrelevant for a universalist like Condorcet. What qualifies individuals for full participation as citizens is what they have in common, namely their reason and their humanities. It's precisely those qualities that make it possible to shift perspectives, to shift standpoints, to escape their own experience and assumptions and identities, and to enter into those of other reasonable beings. So the party of Montesquieu might rightly mock Condorcet's obsessive concern with uniformity. He wasn't in favor just of the universality of citizens' rights. He also, in the Vie de Togo, has a rant on weights and measures, the uniformity of weights and measures, even the uniformity of house facades. I mean, it's easy to mock Condorcet, but that's not the kernel of his view about universalism, which is this stripped down view about what makes us citizens. So it's not a denial of diversity so much as a denial of its relevance to participating in the polity. The modern party of Montesquieu challenges Condorcet's universalism as at best boring. How can bland uniformity compete with the colorful tapestry of human cultures and identities, and at worst as self-deceived, as a fraud or as a fantasy? But as yet, they have no answer to one last challenge from the party of Condorcet. Don't all three values of diversity as a value, whether as beauty, as economic efficiency, as inclusion, don't they all imprison us in our dappled identities? Just as the workers in Adam Smith's pin factory achieve efficiency at the price of narrow, repetitive specialization, and Pliny's flower-spangled meadows achieve their pied beauty by mingling fixed species, the poppy remains a poppy, the bachelor's button remains a bachelor's button, the identities combined in those collectives, college classes, workplace teams, scientific collaborations, forged by diversity as inclusion, are assumed to be permanent and paramount. They are both our life's capital and our life's chains. The result of mere chance and the shuffle of circumstances, our accidental identities trail us like shadows, always and everywhere. Within this framework of diversity, our perspectives are valuable because they are reliably generic and also reliably rigid. I speak as someone who has been on I don't know how many committees simply because I am a woman and have been expected to represent a woman's perspective. There's nothing wrong with that, but there is something wrong with what happens if you dare to step out of that assigned standpoint. Diversity as inclusion rooted itself in our intuitions as a value, in part because it drew upon earlier versions of diversity as an aesthetic and economic value. But that heritage also came with a tacit assumption that diversity was primarily a matter of combining stable kinds, specialized by task or ecological niche, not plastic individuals. Proverbially, the leopard cannot change its spots. Can we still change our perspectives and identities? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Amy. That was brilliant. And I will have to moderate myself to prevent myself from asking all the questions that I have. Ava has already announced that she has one. Jim, no, David, sorry. David, what is your name? Kavi? Okay. What is your name? Heiner. Okay. Shawis? Okay.
And Andrew.
And Andrew.
Oh, and Ava. Did you get Ava?
Yes, I got Ava.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are some people over here.
Okay. What is your name? Christian? Okay. What I have now are Ava, David, Kavi, Heiner, Shuis, Andrew, and Christian. And then comes breakfast tomorrow.
And Leah.
I'm going to hold off on adding further names at this point. Please ask your questions very rapidly and very briefly. Ava.
Can I do it without like?
Yes, you may, as long as you do it quickly.
Comment and a question. Thank you for this beautiful paper, Rainey. Just a comment with regard to our discussion on why maybe after 2005 or whatever, in the French case, there is a decrease in the mention of diversity. One of the major differences, of course, is that it doesn't get institutionalized. It's a kind of an intellectual fashion, whereas in the United States, it does get very much institutionalized, both at universities and in corporations. So that was just one thought. And then now my question, which I think you answered or addressed already. You present diversity and universalism as a dichotomy. I wonder if I actually subscribe to that, because in my opinion, you cannot properly think about diversity if you have not fully acquired a universalist mental frame. In other words, the Baki case that you mentioned could not have taken place in a society that had, or in a legal system that had not fully internalized the value of universalism.
Thank you.
I think what is opposite, if I am correct, diversity is a sub-case of universalism which ignores itself as such. And then the real opposite would be hierarchy and not diversity.
Thank you, Eva. Could you give to David the microphone?
So do I get to answer?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much about the institutionalism tip. I'll follow it up. Concerning diversity and universalism, I don't quite see it that way, perhaps because I haven't fully understood the point. I think that what's really at stake in the 14th Amendment case is equality before the law. But there's also something going on. The fact that universities are involved at the center of all these cases, I think, is significant, because I also think there is an element of hierarchy, but it's an element of hierarchy which is sanctioned by a certain form of universalism, which is meritocracy. And I think that is, as it were, sort of the z-axis going out into the third dimension, which I didn't address at all here. But I do think that that is a form of meritocracy, that's a form of universalism, which sits very uneasily with equality. And that I have not thought through yet, but I think next assignment. So.
Thank you. David.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thinking about sort of the Baki decision and the way that diversity exploded in the United States and in political discourse afterwards, the takeaway I took from what I took from your talk is that diversity provides a very convenient way of papering over division and papering over conflict. That if you are saying that that people deserve to have a position in university because that group has previously been oppressed, has been discriminated against, then you're implicitly setting one group against another. Diversity is a way of saying we can all exist together in this beautiful harmony. And very much the same thing in South Africa. You can try to paper over and erase the history of division and conflict by presuming that diversity, by establishing diversity as a value. So I wonder if, in addition to the different values that you have in diversity, you could add peace as one of these that at least is one of the things that is seen as so attractive about diversity.
Right, except for the fact, and this, of course, takes us right up to 2023 and that case of the Students for Fair Admissions versus the Board of Trustees of Harvard, which argued, look, diversity is just another name for affirmative action. So they called the bluff of the ironic solution and said, you're talking nonsense here. So that's one critique. The other critique was the liberal critics who said, look, this is really about something different. There's a case of historic injustice here and ongoing discrimination. And what you're papering over is history by this kind of let 100 flowers bloom solution. Right. So there were discontents in the ranks.
Well, sure, but the appeal of it was that it seemed to so many people that it would paper over.
Yeah, you got the left and the right holding hands. Right?
Everybody won.
Yeah.
Kavi.
Yes, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. So I have just two comments. First one is that I agree with you that Germany is quite behind when it comes to diversity, not just in terms of the engram, but also in terms of the reality on the ground. I mean, rightly so, women and disabled people are being preferred when it comes to applications, but for instance, non-white people aren't in Germany. But even in the US, the claim towards diversity and the reality seems to be quite different because, for instance, I don't know if my case is representative, but I was in a search committee, and we were told by the administrators that it's not really about the diversity of the candidates, it's about the DEI statement. So the candidate could be from whatever background, but for instance, you could be a white and then have a very good DEI statement and be preferred vis-a-vis non-white people who might not have a very good diversity statement. The second comment I wanted to make is regarding the maybe affinity between diversity as efficiency and diversity as inclusion. I think there is much more in common between those two types of diversity, especially when it comes to basically making use of diversity as a means of valorization for capitalist accumulation, right? So it's kinds of counters racialized and gendered forms of capitalism, because it basically exploits people irrespective of their so-called race and gender, right? So exactly. So here you have basically the valorization of diversity for the sake of capital accumulation,
right. Well,
which is very close to efficiency.
To address the first point last, I mean, the genius of capitalism is that it takes over everything. I mean, there's nothing that it cannot instrumentalize. In terms of the DEI student, that's very interesting. I think this is indicative of a problem which besets many of these programs, and it's simply a classical case of the road to hell being paved with good intentions, which is, there's a genuine desire for a fairer, more inclusive, fill-in-the-blank college, workplace, scientific collaboration, etc. But the means of actualizing that become horrendously complicated and lend themselves to taking proxies for the thing itself, like the DEI statements. And I would also say with regard to Germany, but almost any other place, which is, I'm very sorry to have dwelt upon the American case, but I did so because it did seem to me that that was the epicenter of when this value became a value. But I think that what I mentioned in passing is very true, which is the dimensions of diversity which may be relevant for, say, the United States may not be the dimensions of diversity which may be relevant historically for a country like Germany. And at least I am constantly involved institutionally in those kinds of discussions, which are vexed discussions indeed.
Heiner.
I'm sorry, maybe it's not really fitting to this political discussion, but you were talking about diversity as an aesthetic value. Mm-hmm. I, as an art historian, truly do not see that in European art, and I think also in other arts, diversity was applied to human beings. Human beings had to be represented in an ideal way, even neglecting diversity of the beauties, taking them together to an ideal beauty. So there is, diversity comes only as exotism or as Orientalism and into the aesthetics of the human body. And maybe one could also think how it comes in the picture you showed at the beginning. Yeah. It's just a comment. I don't know. It's not a question.
No, it's really very interesting, and I agree with you. I mean, I think that one thinks, for example, of the canonical bodies. Pliny talks about the canonical bodies, for example, of the Doryphorus, for example, statue of the Polykleitos as the ideal male young body. But there is a context, I'm not sure you would consider it artistic, but it's definitely meant to be spectacular, which are the pageants which are staged. I know them from the early modern period, but I suspect that they have Roman precedents, in which Brandenburg apparently had these kinds of things, in which Friedrich Wilhelm would have courtiers dress up as peoples from all over the world and parade. Now, you may say this is not an art form, but it was definitely meant to be aesthetic in the root sense of the term, namely an appeal to the senses. So I think there was, in that sense, an attempt to use the human body, but not just the human body, but the clothing, all of the accoutrements of diversity for the purposes of visual spectacle.
Shois.
Rainey, thank you for this talk, which was absolutely wonderful to listen to, and for me has shown diversity as recapitulating something of a great chain of being argument. And my question is, in the blueprint of diversity that you present after Pliny, nature is the master orchestrator. The organizational principle comes with the territory of the moral intuition as aesthetic. in the PIN workshop, the market imperative creates a standard of efficiency. So there's something new that has come to the advancement of this metaphor. In its political articulation, the value of diversity neither affirms natural order, it seems to me, nor does it invoke market imperatives. So my question is, what is the trope that delivers the organizing principle of political reason that is behind this new moral intuition in its present iteration?
So the argument, thank you, Charisse. I mean, I think here's the argument. The argument is, so here's the explanandum. Here's what I want to explain, which is, it's really amazing that within, at least my very, one lifetime, a neologism of sort of the 1990s has gone from a word that people had to sort of squint and ask you what you meant to a genuine moral intuition. I do not wish to query the sincerity of people who feel this viscerally as a moral intuition. So that's what I want to explain. And my claim is that the diversity as inclusion, the political, the last stage there, is I hesitate to use the word parasitic, I'll just use it, parasitic upon the prior valorization of the aesthetic and the efficient. And that you can see this glimmering through in the ways in which diversity as inclusion uses symbols, the rainbow, the jacaranda tree, etc., but also the arguments, I'm thinking here of what for me is terra cognita, namely, standpoint epistemology, which is, look, if you want to correct bias in a certain kind of research, for example, let's say it's research on gender, then you should have diversity of gender represented in your research term. It's a very plausible argument, but it depends upon the view that the person you are automatically translates into a standpoint in the way that the division of labor makes you the person who cuts the coil of wire rather than sticks the pin into the slip of paper.
Andrew.
Hi. Thank you so much for a brilliant talk. And I guess my question will piggyback on the last thing you said. And I want to go back to this quote of how the farm boy from Ohio can bring something to Harvard
Idaho.
College from Idaho can bring something to Harvard College that a Bostonian cannot offer. Similarly, a black student can usually bring something that a white person cannot offer. And I was just wondering if we can put a little pressure on what this ineffable something is.
Yeah.
And this something, we're all scared to say and to articulate what this something is, and in so much discourse, it's always this black box, right? And so I was wondering so that's the first part of my question. And the second part is the danger that we pluck the farm boy from Idaho, isn't that itself reifying the characteristics of this farm boy,
exactly the problem.
and without denying his own individual identity?
Yeah, so that's exactly the point. So I think no one would deny that having, and I think this was the idea basically of the Harvard admissions office, which was, look, we could fill the entering class with kids who got complete 800s on their SATs, no problem. But they'd be bored and we'd be bored. And wouldn't it be more educational in terms of expanding life experience, and I think always in the back of the minds of the Harvard admission office in terms of training the nation's elite, to have a group of people who will surprise each other, who will learn from each other, from their life experiences. That seems a very plausible kind of argument. The problem comes, just as you say, with the reification of that identity. So we expect the farm boy from Idaho to remain the farm boy from Idaho. We expect the black kid from South Roxbury to remain the black kid from South Roxbury. And that seems to me the troubled legacy, Trojan horse fashion, of this prehistory of diversity as a value.
Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess my question is just like a water on the mills of what you've just said. Because when I'm remembering the communitarian critique by Michael Sandel, McIntyre, Waltz and all the like, against someone like Rawls and the critique of what constitutes a self and society, and they all bring in all these rich concepts of tradition, whatever, the Idaho farm tradition against whatever. That's what constitutes the self, and that's I think they have a point in it, but that's in some sense it's the beginning of a problem. And if you see now your last stage of that diversity in itself should be a political value, is somehow skipping these problems. Because if we take diversity as something we have to achieve or have to acknowledge, because if we take it serious, okay, we constitute it differently. We do not share the same history and culture, but that's the task, how we deal with it when we come to find a solution how we live as a political society. So the question is the idea of diversity as being inclusive as a value in itself, as a political value, just shortcutting or skipping all the problems of the truth, or maybe the plain truth, that we all definitely are not born as universals or some sense. That our starting point is maybe identity, is biased, is situationed, but that's not the end of the story, that's the beginning of the story and the beginning of the problem, how we deal with it. Yeah.
No, I mean, if I were to ventriloquize Condorcet, the idea would be, look, absolutely, it's a truism that all of us have a distinctive life trajectory, distinctive life experience, cultural heritage, and that this is indeed a source of richness and of instruction for all of us. The question is, why is that relevant to participation in the society, participation in the polity? And then Condorcet takes the abstract universalist view and simply strips us down and says, look, the people in this room have really diverse backgrounds. They speak many different languages, come from many different cultures. But what really matters for all of us participating in this discussion is that we're reasonable people, we're reasonable human beings. And end of story. You know, the other parts can come in the creation of music, the creation of art, the pooling of knowledge, the different kinds of knowledge. You know, I've had the pleasure of co-teaching with Glenn. I've learned a lot from him, from someone in a very different discipline. That's all on top. But Condorcet's view is about what entitles us to be members of, full participating members of a society.
Yeah, thank you. So you spoke about the conflict between diversity and universalism in the 18th century, but it seems to me that a lot of the appreciations of diversity, both in the aesthetic and in the social realm that you described, were actually driven by a move to think about the kind of purposiveness without purpose that we find in nature or in works of art or in society as a symbol to morality. And so the gesture was to say, well, we have all these concrete manifestations of diversity, but all of them in some ways elevate us and somehow reconcile us with this universal that's an aspiration. And when the discussion on diversity transitions from this realm...
What are you thinking of concretely?
Well, I was thinking about, say, Kant on aesthetic judgments, for example, and so the relationship between aesthetic judgments and morality, and that, because that's how I sort of think about when we're trying to reconcile diversity and universality with regard to the aesthetic. But then it seems to me that when later on we have this transition to the political, the diverse actually becomes a license to the privatization of moral standards. So it's in some ways the exact opposite of the reconciliation or the move towards reconciliation that we have in the 18th century. What we get now is the abandonment of this universal aspiration.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it reminds me of Finton's talk last night. And also a conversation I had with Eva Illouz over lunch, which is privatization, the notion of a kind of possessive individualism gone mad, in which you own your diversity, and it becomes, as I said, part of life's capital.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. Lorraine, so there's a kind of diversity that has been introduced today that you haven't talked about, and I'd like to know what you think of it. And it tends to come from the right, and it's called ideological diversity.
Oh, is this the heterodox academy?
Well, one version of that. It's just also I guess the weaker version is the marketplace of ideas, right? And there's something free and beautiful about that, and maybe that the idea that the best ideas will come to the top through that open marketplace. But we've found out that maybe it's neither beautiful, it kind of creates more chaos than order. And I want to know if it fits into this tradition you've looked at, or is this something else, something maybe completely disingenuous?
You know, so it's really interesting to me that this is being repackaged as diversity, which I think is just another tribute to the power of diversity as a value. This is old-fashioned John Stuart Mill, you know, liberalism. The free market of ideas, let the best idea win, it's really, I think it's an indicator of the irresistible rise of diversity as a political value, that it has been adopted as a new way of trying to insert yourself into the discussion.
Philip.
So, Rainey, as usual, I was completely on board with everything you said, but then you said something that surprised me. You were talking about the Harvard board. They expect that the Idaho farm boy will stay the Idaho farm boy, and I thought, no, they don't. What they expect is that a community in which the Idaho farm boy enters as the Idaho farm boy, and the kid from Roxbury enters as the kid from Roxbury, and the rich person's son from Connecticut enters, will come out with a different set of individuals who will have been enriched by their experiences with one another. This is, I think, part of what Elida was after this morning, the idea of the view that you get of yourself through seeing yourself from different angles. And even though these people will shift in their characteristics and their personality, if they enter as a diversity, they are more likely to achieve greatest, this is really Mill, the greater self-understanding. I mean, Mill's, we shouldn't just read chapter 2 of On Liberty. Mill's account of the individual and the development of individuality in chapter 3, and his suggestion that we have to live in and with and towards others for doing this, seems to me very important. And I think that aspect of diversity is beginning to slip away in your talk. And yes. I think it's because you've actually thought of the diversity initiative as thoroughly general. But in the context of an educational enterprise, it seems to me, plausibly justified.
Yeah. No, I completely accept that point, and I agree with you in making the analogy to Elida's talk this morning. I agree that was the aim. And whether it was actually fulfilled or not is another question. And the real question for me is how that I consider utterly laudable aim in creating an educational community became almost unrecognizable once it was institutionalized and legalized, and that you did have a kind of unconscious reversion to the farm boy from Idaho remaining always the prototypical farm boy from Idaho.
The tendency towards generalization and moral issues which have to be treated particularly.
Yeah, or also of a kind of hypostatization that took over. And as I say, this is a guess on my part. This is the hypothesis. Where does this tendency come from? It comes from these faint echoes of these other traditions.
One last question.
Yes. I was wondering whether there's a time frame to this entire debate. When the Bakke decision was taken, the idea was that there was so much catching up to do for all these disfavored persons who could not have entered medical school, but that somewhere perhaps further down the line, more equality would have entered, and that one could become, quote unquote, this horrible term, colorblind again. And I wonder, is there a future for DEI forever? Are identities going to remain the vital element of entering? Or what happens when the Ohio farm boy is going to be a Mexican-American who's, urban and middle class, and the guy from Roxbury is something different? The identities change, or does one have to keep having these faces or identities or even skin colors that have to contribute to the great rainbow? Is there a time element? Can you imagine that in 20 years, or 50, or 100, or 200, the whole thing might seem to be time-bound?
Yeah, so, this is playing out in real time. So probably when you and I were both in college, we were, I think, probably 1 out of 4 in terms of women in our college class. Now, most college classes are more than 50% women. And that means that, the idea that diversity means, giving a certain weight to being a woman rather than a man no longer seems relevant, quite the contrary. And you can imagine this kind of mutating, but I think this forces a discussion which nobody seems to want to have about what are then the relevant dimensions of diversity and why are they the relevant dimension of diversities for this particular place and this particular time to achieve which particular end. Back to Philip's question, what end are we trying to achieve in which particular context? And the wildfire-like spread of the value of diversity and inclusion has obscured that kind of specificity of discussion.
This has been a very specific and wonderful discussion. According to the program, we have 20 minutes until the beginning of the next talk. But why don't we begin a little bit earlier at 4:25? Thank you all for your moderate discussion, and thank you for a brilliant paper.
Thank you all.